Well, good evening. I'm Alan Taylor, the Vice President for Programs for the Benton County Master Gardener Association, and I'd like to welcome you to our second Zoom meeting. Erica Chernow is someone who seems to enjoy moving around. She has taught horticulture classes at Chemeketa College. She's engaged in research at the North Willamette Research Station on strawberries and olives. She went to UC Davis to get a Master of Science in International Agricultural Development. And she's worked as an extension agent in Sacramento County, California. She's moved as far away as Switzerland, where she worked as an integrated crop management advisor. And she is now back in the Willamette Valley as the new commercial and community horticulture agent in Lane County. Erica will speak to us tonight about summer pruning of fruit trees and about fruit thinning. Erica, welcome. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about summer pruning. And I'll kind of just be going over some basic pruning practices and philosophies and things like that as well, because really summer pruning is very similar to winter pruning. Obviously, it just takes part a different time of year. So why do we prune? Obviously, to maintain the health of the tree. I'm sure most of you maybe work in the plant clinic or are at least familiar with all the different pests and diseases that trees can get. And I'll just note, my background's in food crops and agriculture, and obviously I'll be mostly speaking to tree fruits tonight, not necessarily ornamental pruning or anything along those lines. So, but yeah, there's all sorts of different bacterias and funguses that trees can get, and sometimes you have to prune out diseased parts. Another really important thing is increasing ventilation within the canopy of the tree as well. Reducing the humidity within that tree canopy can really reduce fungal pathogens and other types of pathogens from occurring and spreading as well. Anytime you have, that heat and humidity, that's kind of really an ideal environment for a lot of those to grow and propagate. Another major reason that people prune is to train a tree. This is particularly true of young trees. So when you want to determine what their shape or structure is going to be, then you essentially start pruning them at a very young age in order to train them to that shape or desired structure that you're looking for. Obviously, you can help control the size of a tree as well if you need to reduce the height. Or maybe you didn't have enough growth a certain year, you can do heading cuts to kind of increase the vigorous growth of a tree as well. And then of course to increase fruit production. When you open up that tree, you open up sunlight is able to enter into that canopy, that increases photosynthesis and essentially can help increase fruit production as well. Okay, so typically most people prune during the winter, and that really is when you want to do the majority of your pruning. That's the best time to prune. The tree is dormant, it doesn't have any leaves on the tree, so you can really get a good idea of what the shape and the structure of that tree is and what it needs to look like and what needs to be removed as well. You can do it anytime from when the leaves fall off the tree in November all the way through bud swell in early March. February is kind of considered the best month just because typically you're past most major freezes that will occur in the winter, and so it's kind of a better time if you're making cuts and opening wounds in the tree, less likely to have any type of frost or freeze damage to the tree. But you can also prune in the summer as well, and summer pruning, I'll talk about kind of what the goals of it are in a second, but typically takes place between July and mid-August. You don't want to do it much later than mid-August. If you're pruning into September, there's a chance that the tree will put out new leafy growth, and if you end up getting an early frost that year, then you can easily cause damage to that young leaf tissue on that tree and those new shoots on that tree. So you don't want to do it too late in the year as well. But really you can prune any time of year that you want. If a major storm comes through in April and breaks a branch on your tree, you can go in and fix that branch and remove it as well. But the timing will influence how the tree responds to those cuts. So just looking at how winter pruning versus summer pruning, again, in the winter, you're typically training the tree. So you're creating that either open vase structure or central leader or modified central leader, whatever you want the structure of that tree to be. You're typically working on that during the winter pruning time. And again, that's because there's no leaves on the tree. You can really get a good look at it and really kind of shape it. But winter pruning is really going to stimulate growth. So all those carbohydrates that are stored in the roots and the woody tissue of the tree, after you make those cuts, spring comes and all those carbs are going to essentially be allocated into fewer growing points after a pruning. So it helps kind of stimulate new growth in a tree. And it's also a great way, winter pruning is also really for removing crowded or unwanted branches as well. With summer pruning, unlike winter pruning where you're stimulating growth, summer pruning, you're really kind of reducing growth. So if you have a lot of fruit trees can be really vigorous. Cherries are really vigorous trees. Figs are vigorous. Even things like apricots and nectarines can be quite vigorous, whereas maybe not here in Oregon, but certainly down in California, they can be quite vigorous. So a lot of times in summer, you may find that your trees completely, the inside canopy is completely shaded out, and you may need to go in and kind of reduce some of that vigor and reduce some of that growth. So that's typically what summer pruning is used for, is to kind of slow down the growth of that tree. You're typically mostly making thinning cuts during the summertime, and so you're kind of just reducing any vigorous growth and opening up that canopy once again to sunlight as well. So it's typically good to do a little of both. Typically what you want to do is kind of your major pruning, during the winter time, and then follow up with a lighter pruning during the summer as well. Are there any questions this far? So far, so good? Okay, I'll keep going. So just going over the anatomy of a tree, I'm sure most of you know this, but obviously, just in terms, I'll be using some terminology here, but obviously we have our roots, the main trunk, which in this case is kind of the main leader of the tree. This is obviously a central leader tree. You do have suckers that grow up from the root system, and then water sprouts that are very similar to suckers, but just these vigorous shoots that grow typically straight up out of one of the main scaffolds of the tree. And so off of the main trunk, you have your scaffolds, and then off the scaffolds, you have your lateral branches as well. Sorry, it seems to freeze every now and then. This. If Alan or Brooke have any tips on why this happens and what I could do differently, I'm certainly open to suggestions. There we go. Okay, good. We're moving. Okay, so these are kind of the main types that you would train a fruit tree to. Central leader, where obviously you leave that main central trunk in the center of the tree. Modified central leader, you typically will cut that central branch or central trunk down to say 8 to 12 feet, depending on the type of tree, and then you kind of have an open vase from there, or you can grow to a vase or open center structure, at which you essentially cut out that central leader and kind of open up the center of the tree. You can also do a espalier, you can trellis them. There's all sorts of different ways to train trees, but those are kind of the three major ones. Just a few important things to know. You have terminal buds, so those are kind of the apical bud or the last growing tip on the end of a shoot. We also have leaf buds, and leaf buds will put out vegetative shoots. They won't produce fruiting laterals, but they will produce vegetative growth. You have bud scars, where essentially the former terminal bud was, and bud scars are important to recognize because they really help you distinguish the difference between 1-year-old and 2-year-old wood. And that's important when you're pruning, because you don't want to prune off, if you're growing nectarines, you don't want to prune off all your 1-year-old wood where the fruit essentially would be produced. So that's also important to note. And then you also have your flower buds, and those tend to be, I find, plumper, rounder, typically than your leaf buds. Leaf buds tend to be a little more scale-like. It obviously can vary from tree to tree, but it is important to really learn to distinguish between flowering buds and leaf buds. The flowering buds will be the ones that put out the flowers and produce fruit as well. The two main types of cuts that you're going to make when pruning fruit trees are either a thinning cut or a heading cut. With a thinning cut, you're really just cutting back to kind of the main either scaffold or even trunk itself. So you aren't cutting back to certain buds or anything like that. You're really just removing the entire branch. And so thinning cuts will do as they kind of imply. They'll thin out the canopy of the tree. They'll make the canopy less dense. So it really opens up the tree for ventilation and circulation, and also for sunlight penetration as well. Heading cuts are where you just cut off a portion of that limb, and you're usually cutting back to a certain bud so that you can then redirect the growth in certain cases, or just so it puts out more lateral growth. And heading cuts help to produce a denser, kind of more compact canopy compared to a thinning cut. Okay, just a reminder that typically when cutting back to buds, you do want to cut above the bud so that you then redirect that growth. So, you know, on that first photo, you obviously have that little bud that's going to then send out a new shoot and leaves and potentially even flowers if it's a flowering bud. So you want to cut it about a 45-degree angle, just slightly above that bud. You don't want it to be too angular or even too low or close to the bud. If it's too close to it, it could actually dry out some of the cells within that bud and it'll be stunted or not produce good growth. You don't want it to be too high or too flat on top. That can easily rot. And then the one exception is all the way to the right. That would be if you have, you know, all the ones on the left, the four on the left are for alternate budding type branches, whereas the one on the right is for opposite. If you have opposite buds, then you just cut a flat cut right above both of those buds, and then it's going to send out two shoots right above that, or right where those buds are, essentially. So this is just looking at what the response would be. So here again on the left, the photo is showing alternate budding type tree. So the red dotted line is where the cut's made, and you can see it then sent out new shoots directly below the cut and then also further below the cut as well. And you kind of end up with this whorled pattern. And then of course with an opposite bud, it then sends out, it'll have the two buds right below the cut that it then sends out two new shoots on as well. So that's essentially going to be the response to any type of heading cuts that you make, depending on whether or not you have alternate or opposite budded plant that you're working with. And when you're cutting back branches, you know, you can cut them back to a bud, but you can also cut them back to a shoot as well. So, or something that's going to then continue to grow. So maybe you want to redirect the direction of that particular limb. So you cut it back to this shorter shoot that's growing off the main scaffold, this lateral here. And just keep in mind, you want that lateral to be at least, you know, a third to half the size of the part that's being removed as well. So that way it has all the structural support that it needs to maintain that. Okay, when pruning, it's always important to know what your fruiting wood is so that you don't cut that all off and end up with no fruit. So with apples, it's going to be the second year wood that produces the fruit, same with pears. Cherries will produce on first or second year wood. Peaches, nectarines, and plums will typically grow on first year wood. So that is, again, important to note so that you aren't cutting those portions of the tree off. And you know, you always want to maintain your fruiting limbs. So now speaking specifically of summer pruning, really, again, the goal of summer pruning is to kind of just reduce the vigor of the tree a little bit. So any excess branches or shoots or anything that's really just shading out the tree, you would thin those out in order to open up sunlight into the canopy. You're looking to kind of limit regrowth as well. So it's at a time of year where the tree's not necessarily putting a lot of energy into new growth. It will put out some new shoots depending on the tree. Some do more than others. but you're kind of limiting that as well. Whereas when you do winter pruning, you're really stimulating growth. It's kind of the opposite with summer pruning. You're kind of limiting it. But you can also end up inducing formation of new buds, and this is particularly true with pome fruits. So some of the buds that are below any heading cuts that you make, they can actually start producing new fruiting buds after you make that heading cut, and those will then become fruiting buds for subsequent seasons. But when you're summer pruning, again, you're really going to focus on thinning cuts. So anything to kind of reduce the height and allow more sunlight into the tree, reduce the density of the canopy. But you'll also potentially make some heading cuts, especially when working with pome fruits. You know, that's going to help to induce bud development on the buds that are below the cut that you make, and some of those will turn into fruiting buds for the following year. And then you can also make any types of cuts needed as well. Don't, you know, I always say with pruning, just go for it. So, you know, really anything to kind of maintain or minimize the growth if it's too vigorous. And then of course, this is also a great time to go in and remove dead, diseased, and dying wood. It can often be really hard in the winter time to identify what is diseased wood, unless it has some, it's like anthracnose or something, it has some really obvious canker on the bark that you can recognize. There's others that are really hard to recognize. I know hazelnut growers tend to go in the summer to remove Eastern filbert blight, because that's the time of year you see it. And it's the same with like fire blight as well. You may not recognize which branches have fire blight on them in the middle of winter, but it'll be very obvious come summer because it'll be the one limb that looks dead and dying. And so summertime is a great time to come in and also do those cuts to kind of clean up any diseased wood or any dead wood or even broken limbs as well. Okay, so typically in summer, good things to prune are peaches, nectarines. I know we don't grow a lot of those here. People try, but as well as Japanese plums. Those all are really vigorous growers. I would even throw figs into this category. I wasn't thinking of figs earlier, but figs are really vigorous as well. So you can go in and do a pruning in the summer to just, again, open up the canopy, reduce some of the growth. Apricots and cherries are also really good to prune in the summer as well. I was actually talking to Ashley Thompson a couple months ago. She works up in Hood River, and she was telling me a lot of the cherry industry up there has moved to summer pruning because cherries are very susceptible to bacterial disease. And if you do winter pruning, you're opening up a wound in the middle of winter when it's wet. It's very easy for that bacteria to enter in it, and they ended up with a lot of like gummosis and gumming on the pruning cuts that they were doing in the winter time. So now a lot of the commercial growers up in that region are now doing their pruning in the summertime for those reasons. So cherries are a good one to do a little maybe extra pruning in summer compared to the winter time. And then of course, once again, dead, diseased, and damaged wood. Always want to get those out of there. Okay, the things you want to avoid when summer pruning, you know, we do get rains here in the summer. So obviously if you see rain in the forecast in the next week, it's probably good to wait till you have at least a dry spell. That's always true even of winter pruning, if possible, to time it when there's maybe going to be at least 5 to 7 days of sunny weather, sunny, dry weather. You want to avoid heavy pruning in the summer as well. You really want to do your heavy pruning in the winter time, and summer pruning, with maybe the exception of cherry trees or something like that. But summertime should really just be for going in and kind of doing a little thinning out and a little cleaning up on the tree. And you also, again, want to avoid pruning too late. Again, if you're pruning in September and the tree puts out some new shoots and new growth, and then you get a frost, you're going to end up damaging the tree. So always stick within that July to mid-August period, and you don't really want to prune much later than that. Okay, any questions? Pretty straightforward. Okay. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is just fruit thinning. So we're coming upon the time of year where you want to go out and actually thin your fruit trees. So we do this obviously to increase the size of the fruit, and also just prevent breakage of branches. Sometimes limbs can get too heavy with fruit, and that can cause branches to break. So just kind of reducing the weight of the fruit on those limbs is also really important. Another reason is to stop alternate bearing from occurring. So that's when you get a really heavy fruit load one year, followed by a really light load the next year, followed by a heavy year. So it's always this kind of alternate bearing years, where some years you get really good harvest, some years you hardly get anything. So if you are thinning and you're timing your thinning properly, it can actually reduce alternate bearing from occurring. So typically with apples, that means you want to thin within about 40 days of full bloom. And that would be about 60 days for pear trees as well. And it looks like we have a hand raised. So Kathleen, if you want to go ahead and chime in.
Yes, I was wondering about that alternate year, because I had an incredibly heavy year on my first, my plum tree is only 2 years old, but it had a huge amount of fruit last year and has very few plums this year.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do much pruning in the winter. Can I do some summer pruning that will help keep this from happening again?
Yeah, I would do a little summer pruning this year if it had vigorous growth. If you haven't seen much growth on the tree, then maybe I wouldn't. But yeah, if you have a very dense canopy that's just not producing fruit, then I would go ahead and do a little summer pruning to thin it out. But I would still probably save the majority of that pruning for the next dormant season as well. But go ahead and do a little thinning, open up the canopy, try to get some sunlight in there, clean it up a little bit. And then follow up with a good pruning in the winter time.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Okay, continue on. So typically you're gonna thin fruit between late May and mid-June. And obviously you wanna always retain the largest fruit possible, if possible. I know some people go out with like broomsticks and just beat their tree and see what falls. So you know, if that's your method, then obviously you may not always end up with the largest piece of fruit, but you know, if you're up there on a ladder or whatever, you do want to try to retain the largest fruit. I will note that a lot of trees do a natural fruit drop as well, so you'll always want to, you know, wait till after that occurs. With apples and pears, you want to thin to about 1 fruit per cluster. So they, apples in particular, they grow on those fruiting spurs. And those will send out about, you know, 5 flowers per spur. So you want to thin those down to about 1 fruit per cluster and then keep them about 6 to 8 inches apart. So I usually just kind of use my fist with a thumb, or, you know, you can always calibrate your hand just to kind of give yourself a little hand ruler as you're moving through the tree to give you an idea of how close or far apart things are. With plums, you want to thin them to about 4 to 6 inches apart. And then if you have short fruiting spurs, which some varieties do, then you can thin those to 1 to 2 fruit per spur. And then with peaches and nectarines, you want to thin those to about 5 to 7 inches apart along the branch. Okay, so I know a lot of people don't like to thin because they feel like they're losing fruit, but really you're just going to end up with bigger fruit. Healthier fruit, and you're going to really reduce the stress on the tree from a heavy fruit load as well. So the key is to just kind of get up there and do it, and don't look down too much. Don't look at all the fruit that's sitting on the ground. Don't think too much about that. Just kind of get in there and go for it, and you'll be rewarded with bigger, healthier, better quality fruit later in the year. Okay, any other questions about fruit thinning? Okay, I just want to quickly go over some pruning tools. So there's, obviously you'll have some hand pruners, there's the long-handled loppers, hand saws, and you know, the question of whether to have rubbing alcohol to sanitize tools, it really depends if you have diseased wood on your tree. I always think it doesn't hurt to, you know, especially if you do have some diseased wood, drop your pruners into a little alcohol for a minute or two just to sanitize it between cuts. Obviously, if you have 2 pruners, that system works a little better. You can alternate them. But typically what you're going to have is some type of hand pruner. So you do want to get the bypass blades, and that's what you see in this photo here are bypass blades. The anvil pruners, those are really for cutting dead wood. They tend to kind of cut through tissue like a knife cuts through butter. So it's not necessarily a smooth cut. It kind of crushes some of that tissue within the shoot. So you don't want to use anvil blades on, you know, anything that you want to maintain well. I always joke they're good to go cut your blackberries down with, because you probably don't care if you're making clean cuts on those. But these will typically cut up to a 1/2 inch in diameter. I know I usually try to cut something bigger than that, but spare your hands, cut up to a 1/2 inch. And then when it gets bigger than that, then you would move to some type of long handled lopper. And once again, you're going to want bypass blades for these, not the amble type. Length of the handles will vary. You don't want anything too long. They can be kind of cumbersome and really difficult to deal with and maneuver in between limbs and branches and things like that. And these can cut anywhere from, you know, 1 inch up to even 2 inch limbs. And I know I certainly try them on 3 or 4 inch limbs every now and then. And I do go through pruners because of that. So if you want to maintain your pruners, follow the directions of what they tell you it's capable of cutting as well. And then of course you want to sharpen these things, you know, pretty much before every time that you go out and prune. The other thing you'll probably want is a handsaw. These comes in all sorts of different shapes or sizes. You know, they have the folding ones that they kind of fold down. If you get a folding one, make sure they lock. Otherwise, they can fold very easily on your hand, which is quite painful, so you don't want that. And I also prefer the ones that have both push and pull action on them, so that means they're cutting in both directions. For me, those are the easiest to use. And once again, don't get one that's too big. I know it's always tempting to go for the bigger blade, but sometimes those little 6 inch blades are actually quite easier to maneuver in and around different limbs. So think about, you know, maneuverability as well when purchasing pruners. But, you know, if you take care of your pruners, you can have them for a long time. People always ask, do you have to spend money on them? No, you don't. You can get the cheapest pruners available. Typically the cheaper ones do have to be sharpened more often. And they may, you know, they don't always have joints with like bolts and nuts and things that you can tighten and untighten. So typically when they break, whereas some of the maybe more expensive ones, they're made of better steel. They don't lose their sharpness as quickly, and they often have different parts where you can maybe take them apart, clean them, and put them back together again as well. So they tend to be a little longer lasting, but do whatever is within your budget. You know, if I only had one tree, I'd go out with the cheapest pair of pruners possible. If I had maybe 10 fruit trees, I'd probably invest a little more in a good pair of pruners. And of course, a tree ladder is always great if you have one as well. They're 3-legged, so they're a little more stable on uneven ground, which most people have in their backyards. So that's typically what you're going to be looking at when pruning. Are there any questions about that thus far? It wasn't a long talk. Does anyone have any questions that they were dying to have answered about summer pruning that I didn't talk about?
Erica, we had one question come in on chat. Given that there is a normal fruit drop, how long should one wait before doing manual thinning of fruit?
If it's within that thinning time period, you can go out pretty much immediately afterwards. You don't have to wait at all. So yeah, as soon as fruit drops, if you're within that, you know, say late May to, you know, mid-June time period, go ahead and go out and do your manual thinning right after. Any other questions? The one other thing I wanted to mention is codling moth. I was talking to Alan last week I don't remember when we talked, Alan, but when we did, we were talking about codling moth, and I had just put out some traps, and Alan asked if I would keep you guys informed. So yeah, I had last Thursday when I went to check the trap, there were over a dozen codling moths in the trap. So there's a lot of different ways to determine and time your spray with, you know, codling moth. There's these kind of biofix models that you can use that a lot of the farmers use. A lot of home growers are still using pheromone traps. So, you know, we had the trap set. It was up in typically what you want to do, put it in the upper 1/3 of the canopy, check it a couple times a week. And you would time your first spray for when either you get 1 to 2 moths at 2 consecutive weeks in a row, or the first time you get 3 to 4 moths in a single trap, which is essentially what happened last week. So if any of you have apple trees and you need to spray for codling moth, which I think pretty much everyone in the Willamette Valley does, then right now is the time to get out and make that first spray for the first generation. There's a number of different products you can use, from Spinosa to pyrethrins, you know, you name it, they're all in the Pacific Northwest. pest management handbook. Just check there for what active ingredients are registered for use. And you can get out and make your first spray, and then always follow the label directions that will help you determine when to time that second spray as well. Okay, and so the other thing I just want to mention is there's some good pruning publications in our OSU catalog. So there's Growing Fruit Trees and Nuts in the Home Orchard, Training and Pruning Your Home Orchard, and of course, Pruning to Restore an Old Neglected Apple Tree. That one's really good. I know I get a lot of questions about old apple trees. People buy homes or they rent homes and they inherit an apple tree that no one cared for many years. And a lot of people kind of want to know how to bring them back up. And then of course, I also mentioned the book Pruning and Training. It's one of those DK books. It's kind of considered one of the better manuals on pruning if anyone's looking for one. And so with that, I'll go ahead and take any questions. I'm going to turn on my light as well. But if anyone has questions, I'm open for them. Maybe I should go back to...
We're starting to get some questions coming in on chat. The first one says, how and when do you deal with the pruning of water sprouts?
Water sprouts. So that's a good, you know, I prune water sprouts off in the winter. Suckers, the ones that grow up from the roots, I tend to prune off in the summer just because they're less likely to grow back as kind of frequently if you cut them back in the summer compared to winter. I do summer or water sprouts in the winter, just there's usually a lot of them, and they tend to be the things that really block out sunlight within that canopy because they're growing straight up and they can get very tall. So I prefer to go in and get rid of those in the winter time.
Next question. Next question is there a best way to sharpen pruners and loppers?
Yeah, I mean, just get a sharpening stone, and you know, you always want to follow what's kind of the angle of the blade. Obviously push the stone away from you, you know, and then of course oil them up once you're done. Maybe, you know, next year, if we get through this, maybe we can come up and do a face-to-face summer pruning workshop and do a demonstration on sharpening tools and everything like that. But yeah, I really just want to get a good sharpening stone, and always follow the angle of the blade. That's the key, is to not, you know, sharpen against that angle. You want to maintain that natural angle of the blade.
Next question, do all kinds of fruit trees get water sprouts?
I believe so. I'm trying to, I mean, I'm sure there's some, most of our temperate fruits, yes, I'll say that. I'm sure there's some tropical fruits out there that maybe, you know, I don't know that I've seen water sprouts on a mango tree, but it's been a while since I've seen a mango tree as well. So I could just be forgetting.
We have a question. Do you recommend spraying for codling moth whether or not you have set a pheromone trap?
Yeah, I mean, I know for a lot of folks here in Lane County, they depended on my predecessor, Ross, who would go out trapping, and then he would put a big notice up on Facebook and kind of get word out to our plant clinic so that if people called, they would let them know that, yeah, now's the time to spray. So I'm kind of following that method of just saying, okay, I put a trap out. I know we had a couple master gardeners. Ross even had one out. I called them. They all had codling moth in their traps. So that's 3 different spots in the Eugene Springfield area that, you know, had a significant number of codling moths in their traps. So I guess we're kind of considering ourselves the community trappers. And at this point, yeah, you know, if you were off in a very rural area, I know you guys are up in Benton County. So yeah, maybe if you're out in one of the rural valleys of Benton County, I would probably get my own pheromone trap and put that out, just because it could be, or if you're up high in elevation, you know, we're down here in the valley, there could be some differences in terms of temperatures and elevation. So yeah, if you're in a really different spot, it's always a good idea to go get your own trap and set it out and monitor on your own. But if you aren't doing that, we've done it for you. And I know they've caught moths up in Aurora as well. So pretty much all up and down the valley. The adult moths are emerging at this time, and it's really time to get out and spray.
I, for years, decided to rely on other people, more professionals doing the trapping, and I rely on their dates to set a biofix and then time my sprays according to that. So
Yeah.
thanks to you and to Nick Wyman as well for telling us about this.
Yeah, we recognize not everyone's going to do it. So, it makes sense that we're putting that information out there as well.
Okay. One more question in chat. Do you have any recommendations or comments about bagging fruit? Down bags or stretchy nylon bags, anything like that?
Yeah. It's not, if you have the time and the patience, then go for it. I think it's a great method for preventing pests and other types of insects from getting into your fruit. It's not just codling moth, there's apple maggot, there's all sorts of things that can be issues. So yeah, it's labor intensive is I guess my comment, but I also come from a more commercial background. And so when I think of bagging fruit, I'm thinking of farmers with acres of trees, and yeah, going out and having to bag them is quite labor intensive, but for a home grower, it's quite feasible. And if you don't want to be spraying, or you want to reduce the amount of spraying you're doing in your home garden, then absolutely go out and bag fruit. I can say this as well. I used to work quite a bit down in Costa Rica, and bagging fruit helped save the banana industry down there. So it works, and if you have the time to do it, go for it.
I understand that Debbie has a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We have a couple of crab apples that are like a 3-inch fruit, and the darn things bloom unbelievably. And I was wondering if the interval for in between when you try to thin, I never thin them because it's such a job. I'm going to try this year because now they're in alternate years of producing.
Yeah.
One overproduced last year, and this one is going to be the same way this year. But are there any different tips for a small crabapple tree?
Yeah, I would need to look up spacing on those, but it doesn't need to be 6 inches. You're probably looking at 4 inches between fruit. Should be sufficient enough. It's kind of like an apricot. So I would say apricots, are like 3 to 4 inches between fruit you thin to. So I would say go for about that distance and you should be okay.
Thanks.
Okay, Nancy Tovar sent a chat suggesting that Pruning Made Easy by Lewis Hill is a good reference. And then I have one more question that's come in on chat. If branches have been curved down by fruit weight and don't break, but remain curved and harden that way over the next year, is there a recommended way to reshape and get them pointing up again without the same thing happening again on new soft growth?
Yeah, you would basically have to try and train it. So that could be getting like a pole stick and putting it back under that branch to try and kind of hold the weight of it up. That's probably the first thing I would do. I would also maybe consider pruning it back a bit where it starts to bend. I mean, it depends where it's bending, if it's bending straight from the trunk down. But if it kind of goes out and then starts to bend, I would consider doing a heading cut on that to prune out that bent portion and kind of train it back up in a different direction. Or like I said, just get some type of stake or post that you can set under the branch to kind of hold it up and try to redirect it. Growing in an upward direction. You could get a rope, tie it to the trunk and try to, pull it back towards the trunk, but you risk maybe girdling the trunk of the tree with the rope. So yeah, I would say either pruning or some type of structure underneath the branch to try and support it and push it back in the right direction. And thin it also so that it doesn't bend so much the following year. That's what happens when you don't thin, they get so heavy, Yeah.
Well, an interesting question just came in. Any experience with beneficial nematodes?
Not personally, but yeah, I've been in and around projects that use them. Is there any specific question? Always look for the right species. That's the key thing to know. Not every nematode will control every insect that you're looking at for. They're very species specific, so you have to make sure you're getting the correct one. for whatever pest it is that you're looking to control. But yeah, I don't know if there's something more specific than that.
After following all spray applications for peach leaf curl this year, I'm plagued with peach leaf curl.
Yeah.
Do I prune all diseased limbs off now?
Ooh, depends on what all is. I'd hate for you to end up with a twig sticking out of the ground. Yeah, it's a bad year for peach leaf curl. Also, for those of you with plums, you probably have aphid issues that also cause leaf curling. Yeah, peaches in Oregon are tough. You know, if peach leaf curl gets severe enough, it will defoliate your tree, which can cause it to die a few years later. So doing anything you can to try and save it this year. If you're out of sprays, then yeah, I would prune off some of it. You obviously, you know, it depends on the severity of it. Like I said, you don't want to prune it so far back that you don't have anything left. But yeah, if there's a logical way to prune it and still maintain some, you know, leaves so that it can continue to photosynthesize and grow and produce, then I think it's worth giving it a try. And always destroy those prunings as well. Don't just leave them on the ground, but get them out of your orchard, send them off to the landfill and let them compost and deal with them. And for those of you who are thinking of peach trees, get one that has peach leaf curl resistance. You'll still have issues with frost and blooming and other issues, but at least it will take care of that problem for you, which is quite prevalent here in Oregon. So.
Okay, that looks like that's the last of the questions. Okay. Erica, thank you very much for your talk.
Thanks for having me.
As vice president, I get to choose the topics, and so I've been picking things that I wanted to learn about, and you succeeded tonight. I learned a lot. And so, again, thanks very much, and welcome back to Oregon.
Yeah, thank you. And once we get through this, if you ever want to do a hands-on workshop, then let me know. I'm happy to come up and do that with you all.
Okay, I'd love to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right. Just a couple of quick announcements for the members. One is, as I said, I choose programs that I'm interested in. However, I'm certainly open to suggestions for future programs, for things that you're interested in learning. So get in touch with me. I'm in the Master Gardener directory. Email's the most reliable way to get me. I have no idea how things will work out over the next few months. Typically, we have garden visits or field trips during the summer. We might be able to do one on the Oregon State campus this summer, but some of the other things I was planning just won't be able to happen under the current conditions. So perhaps we can have more Zoom meetings like this. So get in touch, let me know, let Brooke know, let Elizabeth know, and we'll see what we can work up. Otherwise, our next regularly scheduled meeting, and again, who knows if it'll happen, would be the September picnic, and then the membership meeting with the election of officers in October. But that's still months away. But maybe we can do more of these if we can't meet in person. So get in touch, let me know if you have ideas. And in the meantime, everybody, thanks for joining us tonight. Stay safe, stay well, and good night to all.